So this video is going to be about passive transport, but you do need to know there are two main types of membrane transport. The first one is going to be passive transport, and the second one is basically going to be the opposite of that, which is going to be active transport. And I'll have another video on active transport. But this video is going to focus on passive transport. If you think about that word passive, what does it mean to you? I mean, it's not very active, someone who sort of takes a back seat. And so passive transport doesn't take any energy to move molecules across the cell membrane. And so a couple of types of passive transport that we're going to talk about are going to be diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. Diffusion is sort of the main type of passive transport. And in diffusion, particles basically move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, and it does this with no energy. Particles want to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Okay? So, in this picture example, we have a dropper that dropped some red food coloring here. And so notice that there are two sort of concentration gradients going on. In this concentration gradient right here, which is what you might focus on, you have a very high concentration of those red food coloring molecules. But in the other system, we have a high concentration gradient of water molecules. And so both of those are in high concentration, and they like to go to areas of low concentration. For the water molecules, they want to go over here, and for the coloring molecules, they want to go basically anywhere that other food coloring particles are not. And so ultimately, we end up getting very diffuse and spread out food coloring, and you didn't need to mix it. You don't need to have it at a certain temperature. It will naturally go from that high concentration to the low concentration if given enough time. And so diffusion, and the driving force for that is just they want to move across the membrane. It's based on random movements of particles. It's actually based on particles that are bumping into each other. And them bumping into each other, they'll bump into each other more when they're in a high concentration, and that will basically move them and bump them out to where there's a low concentration. And so it's based on these random movements of particles, and it takes no energy at all. So that's the big thing. No energy for passive transport. And these particles will move in that given high to low direction until equilibrium is reached. And so equilibrium, if you think about what makes up that word, you hear that word equal there. In equilibrium, you have an equal concentration of particles on either side of a membrane. So that's not equal quantities, but more like an equal percent, 70% and 70%. Not necessarily equal numbers. And so the other big thing that you need to know is that at equilibrium, particles still move. They still move back and forth. Remember, particles don't have eyes and they don't have brains, so they don't know, oh, all of a sudden we're at equilibrium, so we have to stop moving. They continue to move all the time. They just move at the same rate in both directions. There's no overall direction of membrane movement. So for example, in this image, we have a high concentration of particles on the top of the image and a low concentration of particles on the bottom of the image. So obviously the particles will be colliding with each other more on the top of the image, and that will produce a net movement from high to low with no energy expended across the membrane from the top to the bottom. And as we see this, we have particles moving even more. And eventually we get to equilibrium, but the thing we need to know is they will still move. One will move one direction, the other will move the other direction, and yet the concentration will stay the same. So again, in passive transport, no energy is required. Now, some particles can move freely across that membrane, and remember that membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. And there are certain properties of that phospholipid bilayer where certain particles can just move right through. They're small, so they can fit through many of those phospholipids in there, and they need to be nonpolar in order to get through that section of fatty acid tails which are hydrophobic. Okay? Nothing that is hydrophilic will get through that membrane easily. All right? So those little things can just cross through with no help needed. All right? However, those aren't the only things that cells want. There are going to be lots of ions. So for example, we have a chloride ion here, or larger molecules that can't pass through those hydrophobic parts of the membrane. Either they're too large or they're polar or charged. So they will need some help. So this is a really nice image of this. We're going to talk about water in just a second. This image is sort of not true with water because we know water is obviously hydrophilic. It likes itself. But here's you have some non-charged small molecules that can go through. But here a large macromolecule is being turned away and a charged molecule is being turned away because those will not want to go through the membrane. And so in order for those items that can't readily pass through a membrane or easily pass through a membrane, in order to get those across, they need some help. And that's where facilitated diffusion comes in. And so if you think of that word facilitated, or like facilitator, it's someone that's going to sort of help you out. And so facilitated diffusion, these larger or charged molecules will only be able to diffuse across the membrane if given special protein channels, okay? So these channels will be sort of like bridges or tunnels through which these charged molecules can move through the membrane without being affected by that hydrophobic center to the membrane. It's sort of like how a little kid needs to hold somebody's hand to cross a street. It's going to get to the same place and it requires the same amount of energy, but they need a little bit of help getting there. They can't do it on their own. And so the big thing you need to know is that facilitated diffusion is still diffusion. It is still passive transport. It doesn't require any energy to move the molecules, and just like enzymes, membrane proteins will be very specific. Certain channels will only let certain molecules in or out of the membrane, and other things won't. So there's actually a whole boatload of different protein channels and carrier proteins on your cell membranes for every possible item that they want to bring in or out of your cell.